from the campus of the University of Pennsylvania Wharton School.
This is Wharton Moneyball on Business Radio.
Hello, sports fans, statistics fans, and business fans. I'd like to welcome you to Wharton Moneyball, a show that we've been doing for the last 7 years. This is the podcast version here on Sirius XM 132 Business Radio, powered by the Wharton School. I'm Eric Bradlow, professor of marketing and statistics, and I'm here with my co-hosts today, Adi Weiner and Shane Jensen, both professors of statistics. Some combination of the three of us, and our co-host Cade Massey are here every week here on Wharton Moneyball. We obviously have been having a great format, we hope, for the last year and a half, which is the first quarter we typically talk about COVID, and so we will do so again today. The next 2 quarters will be our open sports segments. We'll be talking about what caught our eye in sports, and there's tons and tons of stuff going on in sports now, so we have a lot to talk about. And then in Q4 of the show today, we have one of our longtime friends. Matter of fact, we just discussed, I'm sure he's the 5th most person that's been on Wharton Moneyball, and that's Neil Payne, senior writer for 538. And we'll be talking to him about baseball and basketball. So Adi and Shane, how are you guys doing today?
Pretty good, I have to say. I'm headed off to Yankee Stadium again tonight. I'm looking forward to that. So
so hopefully you'll see another a big Ohtani home run.
I'd love to see Ohtani. I don't know. I haven't checked the papers yet. Is Trout actually making his appearance yet? I think it's a little too early.
I haven't seen that, but let's start with COVID. We can talk about the Yankees and their demise all day long if we wanted, but let's start with COVID. So Adi usually kick us off here in the first segment. And again, for listeners that want to join in, while normally this is a call-in show, obviously we're recording this asynchronously here on Sirius XM. You can reach us at moneyball@wharton.upenn.edu. That's moneyball@wharton.upenn.edu. We take email questions that way. As a matter of fact, I think we have a few that we're going to talk about in our Qs 2 and 3 today. So Adi, why don't you start us off? What's caught your eye in COVID?
Okay, so what's caught my eye in COVID is again in Israel. Israel is a dramatically interesting case because it vaccinated so early and so completely. And it opened consequently very early relative to other sort of Western European countries. They are experiencing a fairly large increase in cases. Much so,
just to be clear, just to be emphasized,
cases. They see, and I'll make it 100% clear now, they see no increase in deaths and much more importantly, no increase in hospitalization. But they are seeing a very sudden and rapid increase in cases.
And just for our listeners, can you tell us the data? What fraction of people in Israel have received? Let me ask you. Okay. I don't want to interrupt you, but I need some specific data.
Background.
Did Israel primarily use Pfizer and Moderna, not Johnson & Johnson?
Okay, so I shouldn't say it used exclusively Pfizer, but the vast majority of the population used Pfizer.
Okay, so let's assume that the data you're going to tell us relates to Pfizer.
It relates to Pfizer.
What fraction of the, let's say, even say 18 plus population in Israel has been vaccinated twice?
Yeah.
And then how many once, just to give us a baseline here?
Okay, so it's an interesting point because it's over, I believe it's over an 18 population is about 80%.
Okay, let's compare everyone. In the US right now, we're at about 45% doubly vaccinated 18 plus, and about 66% at least one dose. So just to baseline everybody.
Right. So we're a little behind because of the dosages. Israel actually has announced that they have a large supply of vaccinations, but by the end of July, they expire and they have no more coming. So it's interestingly that the rate of vaccinations have picked up by a factor of 5. It's from a low base. But what you're looking at in Israel is 2 populations that have been vaccination resistant. One by design. They don't vaccinate under 16 in Israel.
Yep.
I think they may be rethinking that. Because that is the group of the I think it's the 12 through 16-year-olds that have been showing up with the Indian variant, or I think they call it the Delta variant.
Delta variant.
And it really is contagious. So that they've seen it. Now we're talking about from essentially 0 cases to hundreds. It's not like we're talking about anything in the neighborhood of 10,000, which is what they had at their peak daily. But it was sufficient cause that they actually shut down the visitors from foreign visitors into Israel just completely, which was a change. They were supposed to be open starting tomorrow to foreigners who wanted to come and visit Israel. They're not anymore. and they're being extra cautious. They're not seeing any rises in hospitalizations or deaths, but they are seeing a large number of cases. They are mostly in unvaccinated people, particularly children, but there are lots and lots of breakthrough cases, and that is.
I just want to be clear. If you looked at, since just to remind our listeners here, no vaccine is 100% effective. Obviously, the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna, were much more effective than they thought. The ratio, essentially, when they say they're 95% effective, one way to think about it is for every 20 cases you see, you would expect 19 of them to be for unvaccinated people and one of them to be for a vaccinated person.
Well, that depends on the relative size of the base rates. Since the vaccinated people are much, much larger in proportion of the adult population, you would actually don't see that because almost, the vast majority of people are vaccinated. So the base of people from whom that you're dealing with is smaller among the unvaccinated. So I believe it's about 2 to 1 in Israel. It's hard to say because these numbers trickle out in different, in other words, 2 to 1 unvaccinated to vaccinated. And remember, vaccinated people are outnumber unvaccinated, at least among the adults, by about 5 to 1. So you're seeing, I think in Israel, they're seeing about 90 to 92% effectiveness in terms of preventing infection. It's probably much, much higher in terms of preventing hospitalization or death, but it was sufficiently large to kind of see a change in policy. And that's really what I'm recalibrating my forecast for the US. I think that there
on what aspect?
Because I think we have still a large fraction of our country who is either not vaccinated now and probably won't ever be vaccinated.
Well, just to give you an example, there was a new article related to what you're saying. Mm-hmm. People think while we may not end up with at least at the moment, a national pandemic again, there's an article, as you probably saw it too, there are 5 states, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Wyoming, that have under 35% vaccination rates right now. And they're and by the way, the cases and cases have gone up and hospitalizations have gone up in those areas dramatically over the last month or so. And the expectation is that will continue. And actually, they may need to have localized shutdowns in those areas.
Yeah, so I actually think that those places where have it the worst are probably the most reluctant to do any kind of shutdown, and the places that will have it the least are probably the most interested in shutting down. I do believe that we'll be seeing measures taken again in this country, even in some of the big cities by the fall.
Is the reason that you?
That's my forecast.
Yeah, is the reason that you've changed your forecast? And by the way, since we're all Bayesians here, is that we take the data, we update our prior beliefs to posterior beliefs. Is the reason you've updated your forecast, let's say even from 2 months ago, maybe because you didn't foresee, no one really foresaw this Delta variant, which is much more contagious. It actually, and conditional on you get it, it's a higher hospitalization rate. Is that the reason you've, and maybe you believe, I'm just asking for you, it's not right or wrong, just to believe. Did you believe that we would possibly have more uniform and higher vaccination rates? And it's the combination of a new variant with higher contagiousness, higher hospitalization rates, and lower than you expected vaccination rates that we are where we are. Is that the rationale?
So I definitely think it has to do with the Delta variant, which was obviously unpredictable. But I think the second thing is the issue for which I didn't know the answer to, and I had to guess. So it's really, think about it epidemiologically. There's a very big difference between randomly giving the vaccine to 80% of the population and giving it to 80% of the population the way it actually transpired. Why? Because the way it actually transpired is there are huge pockets of this country, some by design, some by choice, that are very similar and live in similar circumstances with each other that are not vaccinated, and they see each other, and they create this homogeneous pocket of unvaccinated community whereby the virus can replicate and spread.
Well, this is what we talked about last week. Remember, we used the word homophily, and birds of a feather flock together.
That's right.
If you're vaccinated, probably most of the people you know are vaccinated. And if you're unvaccinated, probably most of the people you know are unvaccinated.
And I think that's true. If you ask yourselves that, I mean, this is really huge. I feel like everybody I know is vaccinated with obviously a few exceptions, but it's vast majority. And I would guess if I talk to people who are not vaccinated, they would say, well, most of the people that they know are not vaccinated. It's a huge divergence. And what this does is that if you think about it, this allows the reproducibility number to stay high. And that's really the issue. It has to, you want to keep it below 1, but if an infected person can run into enough people that are not vaccinated, that'll allow them to transmit it. If 80% of the people they know are not vaccinated, are vaccinated, it'll die with them, if you will. And that's really the difference. So if I had to forecast, what does this mean? What does this mean? It means to me that I think that we will be seeing potentially some rethinking of these large gatherings indoors without masks come the fall. I hope not, and I'm not going to bet that much money on it, but I think we are going to do that.
Let me ask you just a quick follow-up, and then I'll let Shane jump in here. Do you think if an indoor event with a large gathering, and they're not unlikely to do this, but required proof of vaccination, would you actually be okay then with it? Do you think it would then, as long as everybody was doubly vaccinated, or are you worried even among that population?
Well, I'm going to confess, I'm not worried about, I would go and I wouldn't have a problem. I'm just predicting what the government will do, not what you or individually should do. I have no problem being at a baseball game. I have no problem being at a show or an indoor set. I've been vaccinated. Everyone that I know is vaccinated. I don't expect life to have no risk. And I don't think that you'll be seeing hospitalizations or deaths coming up. What I'm expecting is a reaction, and that we'll be worried about this rather than needing to worry about it.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to kind of the fascinating. It's not particularly analytical, but like kind of the psychological or public policy aspect of this is what does have to rise, or what does have to happen for us to start taking isolating measures and start shutting stuff down again. I'm with Audie. It's sort of like, I don't think a rise in cases necessarily, it makes me anxious given my vaccinated status, et cetera. But a rise in hospitalizations, is that enough? Or is it, do we wait until the hospitals are close to getting overwhelmed again? These are the kind of, and obviously it's going to be extra fascinating because there is no single answer to that question, even if I'm sure every politician has one in mind, but there's going to be a huge variance between regions as far as what the answer to that question is. Yep. And again, as Audie kind of pointed out when you first listed off some of those ones that are kind of have a rise in hospitalizations right now, those are the regions of the U.S. that are probably most likely to have, to not take action, or at least not take quick action.
So we're here on Wharton Moneyball. This is Eric Bradlow, Professor of Marketing and Statistics. I'm here with my co-host this morning, Professor of Statistics Audie Weiner, Professor of Statistics Shane Jensen, some combination of the three of us, and our primary host and friend, Cade Massey, are here every week here on Wharton Moneyball Podcast Edition. And again, you can listen to us throughout the week. We're doing what we've been doing the last 18 months or so, which is talking about COVID during the first segment. So guys, here are some numbers that I have found just today about, and it relates to exactly what you were saying, Shane, about cases, deaths, and active cases. And my question to you is this the new normal, or using your words, Shane, is these the numbers that we're just going to say, well, that's what it is, and we're not going to do anything? Just so you know, depending on what website you go to, and this is also interesting, the number of cases yesterday was somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000. That was new cases. The number of deaths was somewhere between 96 and 137, depending on which website you went to. And the number of active cases is about 4 to 5 million, which is not inconsistent with 10 to 15,000 new cases per day. Should we expect, like in some sense, Audie, you've said this in the beginning, about, in a normal flu season, about 100 people die a day. That would be 30,000 plus a year. Should we expect that going forward, we're going to have 4 to 5 million active cases at any one time, 8 to 10,000 new cases a day, and 100 deaths a day, and that's just what we'll live with.
Wait, can I check?
Or of course, eventually though, you will run out of people that actually, if you believe that having COVID prevents you from getting further infected, then eventually, this is what, by the way, before I get to you, Audie, in marketing, we talk about this as the Bass model of diffusion. It's the classic expression, you can only die once, which is once you've adopted the product, you can't be a first-time adopter again. So in some sense, the denominator is going down because the number of vaccinated people plus the number of COVID people, that number keeps going up. The number of highly susceptible people is going down. So even if the base rate stayed the same, you'd expect a decline because just the number of people that are highly at risk goes down.
Well, let me just check your math on it. You just said there's about 10,000 cases a day. So
new cases, 10 to 11,000 to 15,000, right, depending on what website you go to.
So when you say active cases, you mean at people who had it at any one point, or do you mean currently active cases, the unresolved cases?
So the way they defined it is people that, like, for example, they define it as unresolved cases, like people that have had it within a certain time frame.
So then how do you get several million currently active if there's about 10,000 a day? And what is a case resolves in about 2 weeks on average, or 3 weeks on average?
Yeah, so I don't, I just looked at the Worldometer website. They define that as the number of active cases. I don't know how, it's good.
Seems a lot rather high. Just I would guess it'd be more like 200,000 rather than.
You would certainly think if you just took 2 weeks times 14 days times 14 to 15,000, you get to 200,000.
Yeah, that just seems a little off to me. But let's just put that aside for a moment. One of the things that I noticed, particularly about hospitalizations and deaths, is that the CDC, when they aggregate, they're not really differentiating, at least at this level of the data. Eventually they will, but at this level, this sort of surveillance level data, they just note, did you have a positive test while you were in the hospital or when you died? And they already will immediately recognize that there are people dying with COVID, but not from COVID. And right, particularly vaccinated people, they're often asymptomatic. And COVID testing is absolutely standard now. Anytime you enter the hospital or even think about entering the hospital in your pre-admission testing. So there's a lot of people getting tested, and a lot of vaccinated people and unvaccinated people are showing up with asymptomatic positive tests.
Let me ask you a question. Have you seen any data right now, since we're an empirical show, a data-oriented show, to suggest that but once the phase 3 trials were over, that essentially it's not 100%, but like near 100% prevention of hospitalization and deaths due to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine? Have you seen any indication that it's not in the very high 90s?
I don't see any indication it's not in the very high 90s, but it's not 99.9. It's lower than that. It's absolutely clear that there have been hundreds of Americans fully vaccinated who have died of coronavirus.
Hundreds.
It's not
right,
clear what their circumstances were, what their medical conditions are. I just spoke to someone whose family who grew up in India and now lives in America, has been for America for a long time, who knows an Indian doctor who was fully vaccinated, who went to India to help. This is a terrible story. Who died of corona Delta variant in India, even though being fully vaccinated. So I don't believe if you walk into a zone where prevalence is extremely high, and that's a hugely important factor, which we always forget.
Great point.
In March and May, and the worst times here, coronavirus was everywhere, and the randomness was whether you actually got it even when you were exposed. Now the randomness is to run into someone who has COVID because it's so much more less prevalent. You don't want to go to a war zone. That's a bad place. I mean, what I mean by a war zone is a place where coronavirus is rampant. And I don't think we'll ever see that here in the United States again because of vaccinations.
And I mean, I think it's worth sort of just to follow up on that. It's worth kind of thinking. I mean, we think about immunization as a binary thing. You either are immune or you are not.
Right.
When in fact, obviously, our immune system does not quite work that way. And so it's worth kind of keeping in mind that, I consider myself somewhat fully protected from COVID, but it is within the context of not necessarily putting myself in extreme exposure sort of situations, because I think those kind of, in cases where there's a heavy prevalence, is where you're much more likely to get these kind of breakthrough cases, I think.
Well, just to give an example, I was at an indoor sporting event the other day. I told you I was at the Suns Clippers game. They checked everybody's vaccination or a negative test within 48 hours on the way in the door. My son and I were wearing our masks at our seats as we were told to. And then eventually during the third quarter, my son, who's 15, looked over to me and said, "Dad, what are we doing here?" They checked everybody on the way in the door. We've been vaccinated. So I must admit, during the fourth quarter, to boo as bad as the game was being played, I had to have my mask off to do a little bit of booing and to say, wow, this is awful, terrible basketball. I don't care about either of these teams, but I would like someone to make a shot in the final score in the fourth quarter, not to be 15-14. Either way, I agree with you, Adi. I think, remember, exposure, even this was always true, exposure, length of exposure, dosage of exposure is always one of the major factors, if not the major factor, in the likelihood of getting it, given you're exposed. Like just because you walk by somebody with coronavirus, even if you see them for 3 seconds or 2 seconds and you walk past them very quickly, the odds are very low. If you're in the same room with a lot of people with it, then the odds, of course, are very different. Right. I have one other topic related. I saw, as you guys may have seen, there was a New York Times article that just came out yesterday. I don't know if you guys saw it, but it basically said that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine may last years or forever. In other words, apparently there's some way that it gets in your bone marrow, and that in some sense this is your infantry. If coronavirus ever comes and attacks you again, that it will reemerge and start assaulting and doing whatever it's going to do to prevent the protein attachment and the replication. This article seemed to suggest, and had a lot of prominent people talking about this, we may never need booster shots. So what are your guys' thoughts about this article and what was said in there? Adi, why don't we start with you and then we'll go to you.
I read it. I don't pretend to know it. I don't pretend to be able to critique it because it's absolutely way out of my wheelhouse medically. I'm not necessarily that surprised considering how effective the vaccine is. But I do believe that booster shots are more likely than not, only because, well, I hate to sound like a real cynic, but I do believe there's a lot of money to be made in booster shots, and that we will, and I think there's going to be an appetite for them, particularly if people thought that they protect against potentially more contagious or deadly variants. And if it just does continue to linger as I'm expecting it to do, and I think that will mean that people will consider it. I'm not sure it'll be that necessary, but I do think it'll be considered, and we will be considering taking them.
Yeah, and as Adi mentioned, I think the variants is the arrival of the development of new variants, I think, is kind of the key part of this. I mean, certainly I've no reason to disbelieve the science that this particular current Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, kind of protect against the current version of COVID that we've been dealing with over the last year and a half. But we're already seeing all these kind of variants pop up, and thankfully none of them seem to be kind of have really escaped the vaccines that we currently have. But I personally think it's probably only a matter of time before some variant does develop that is at least somewhat resistant to the vaccines that we currently have, and that's when we'll certainly start needing boosters.
Yeah, I think that's why, Shane, your point, and Adi made this point earlier, which is people say, well, I don't live in that area. What does it matter? Yeah, but the problem is replication and continued viruses lead to mutations, which lead to a potential variant that we all care about. And this really is one of those situations where, the ad campaigns they're using, don't just get a shot for yourself, get a shot for others, is true, because the longer this continues to go on, not just in the US, but worldwide, it's back to Adi's point about why Israel might be smart to close its borders, is because if someone comes in with a variant that all of a sudden Israel is not resistant to, then especially if they're out of vaccine or none of us have a booster for that vaccine, they could be back like all of us at square one, and they don't want that to happen either.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a humanitarian disaster if a country or any kind of area basically throws away vaccines right now because they somehow have run out of a willing populace to take them. Israel's got several countries on their border they could just hand those out to that I think would be willing.
They tried.
But, well, yeah. No, I mean, in Israel's case, the politics of the situation certainly mess things up, make it more messy. But more generally, I do know that, for example, Montana was giving out, vaccines at the border, Canadian drivers coming down, because they sort of see that they want that border to stay open, and they sort of see that as kind of, I think it's in our public health interest, to try and get these vaccines out globally as much as possible now that we basically, have enough in the country to do all of our willing population.
So actually I have two things on the horizon. I mean, one of the things is we aren't vaccinating under 12s. And 12 to 16 are more recently being vaccinated. And they have observed that there are much more frequent side effects from the vaccine in the younger population, particularly a myocarditis, which is an inflammation around the heart. In most cases, it resolves and it goes away, but not in every case. And it is a reminder that vaccinations do have rare but serious complications. And I think we're still trying to figure out how frequent they are, even though we have massive amounts of people taking them.
Bobby, before we leave this topic, you've been one of the people that have talked about, you say, well, obviously for someone like you and me in our 50s, of course you're going to get the vaccine. But you might call giving someone under 12 or even 12 to 16, like they're really doing public service, because you could argue the potential side effects, the rate of that could be at least as high as the rate of actually getting a serious illness as a result. So I just wanted to have you touch on that before you move to your second topic.
Well, I 100% agree. 12 to 16-year-olds are doing public service. And I'm going to throw this out because it seems to be running about 4-to-1 males. So the myocarditis, the inflammation in the heart, lots of things about COVID have disproportionately affected men. They die worse. And this myocarditis seems to be worse for men. Men just are weaker. I mean, let's just be honest, folks. Our immune systems, we're not built to survive childbirth. And I don't know whether that's a total outlandish thing to say. I mean, that's true. We aren't built for that. But it does seem to have ramifications. And yeah, I think, and I don't have anyone under 12 in my family, but I'd like to wait to see what really develops on that, because that's super public service under 12, because they don't even spread it that much and have essentially zero risk of complications. And now you're talking about a vaccine. My second question was really more for Shane. Did we open the border with Canada yet? Is that known yet? I don't even know.
It's not officially open yet. Like for purely kind of recreational travel. I think if you had a real reason to get into Canada, you probably could, but it's not open yet.
And the Blue Jays are still playing in Buffalo.
No.
Yes.
The Blue Jays are playing in Tampa, aren't they?
I think
Buffalo. Who's playing in Buffalo?
No. I was at a Blue Jays Tampa Bay Rays game in Tampa.
Well, that would make sense. It's at Tampa Bay.
Yeah, no, right. I mean, I think they're playing their home games still in Buffalo. I mean, I do know that they had to get the Canadians even to kind of play in out of their kind of like, bubble, basically, to play in the latter half of the playoffs, had to get special permission from the government. So I believe the Blue Jays are still playing their
when you say
both their home and away games in the United States.
I just want to be clear. We're talking about baseball or hockey? I'm
Baseball. You talked about the Blue Jays, right?
Yeah, the Blue Jays, baseball.
Yeah.
No, I'm pretty sure I'm 99. I was at a game. The Blue Jays played a home game in Dunedin, Florida against the Tampa Bay Rays.
Oh, if it was a home game, that could be. I mean, I thought
they are.
I guess I haven't been tracking that closely. I thought they were still playing their home games.
They're definitely.
Regardless, they are not actively crossing the border during the baseball season.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been the first quarter of Wharton Moneyball. We've been talking about COVID. Obviously, we have 2 quarters to go. We'll be doing our open sports segment. So please stay with us and join us right after the break.
You're listening to Wharton Moneyball
on Business Radio.
Welcome back to Q2 here of Wharton Moneyball, the podcast edition. This is Eric Bradlow, Professor of Marketing and Statistics, and I'm here with my co-host, Professor of Statistics Shane Jensen, Professor of Statistics Adi Weiner. Some combination of the three of us and Cade Massey are here every week here on Wharton Moneyball, here on Sirius XM 132. And again, for the last 18 months, we just finished up quarter one, where we talked about COVID. For the next 2 quarters, we'll be having open sports. And then in the fourth quarter, we're fortunate today to have joining us Neil Payne, a longtime friend of the show, senior writer at 538. Well, guys, it's this time of year again. And, it's time for us to start thinking about the biggest sporting event of the year, the Super Bowl in my household, which is the July 4th Nathan's Hot Dog Eating Contest. So just to remind every one of our listeners here, this is something that is sanctioned by a very important federation, the WFOCE, the World Federation of Competitive Eating. There is it is going to be an outdoor event this year. However, it's not going to be right in front of the Nathan's hot dog place. It's actually going to be in a stadium in Coney Island. They're actually having it this year. And they're actually hosting it there, but it's on July 4th. It's actually starting, for those listeners that want to watch it, it'll be on ESPN, starting at 11 a.m. this year, not 12 a.m. So for those people, don't turn on at your normal time of noon to watch the hot dog eating contest. And there's obviously there's a couple big things. One is Joey Chestnut he's now the 5-time reigning champion, but he's won 13 out of the last 14, as people know. He was only defeated this once by Matt Stoney, who's also competing again this year. We have a big shift in the women's section. Miki Sudo, who's won, I believe, 7 straight titles in the female event. She will not be participating this year because she's pregnant. And so the women's field is wide open. But I wanted to start with you guys. Let me give you a couple of things about the event that we know. So right now, Chestnut is minus 1,500 against the field. So any initial thoughts about that? So obviously, translating, that gives him about a 95% probability to win.
Why is he so dominant?
Well, this is, I don't want to call it, I don't know if this is even respectfully gets a nature versus nurture question. Maybe he's got a throat and esophagus that's more built towards eating things quickly. Maybe he's got a stomach that actually has greater plasticity just by nature.
But there's nothing kind of about his strategy, either in during the competition or sort of outside of the competition that kind of sets them apart.
That's basically a great question. The answer is no. So they all do the same, eat multiple hot dogs followed by buns dipped in water, multiple hot dogs, buns dipped in water. Everybody since Kobayashi started this strategy back in the mid 2000s. This is everybody's strategy. So no, nobody just leisurely eats hot dogs and buns or puts mustard on it or anything like that. It's everyone uses the same technique. So no, that is not a differentiator. Yeah, Adi?
Yeah, I guess my question is, what is it that makes someone enter the field of professional eating? And that maybe addresses your question. Are they people who at a young age recognize that they have this incredible capacity to consume large amounts of food, and that someone suggested they should try one of these contests? They train a little bit, they get better quickly at it. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what it is that makes a professional eater a professional eater, and maybe that'll answer some.
Well, I'll play
what's going on with Joey Chestnut.
Yeah, I'll play a sports developmental thing. I think I'll play even just, I'll call it reinforcement learning, which is obviously it means one thing in machine learning, but it means another thing in in the psychology of why we do things. Don't we like to do things that we're good at? So I would imagine that competitive eaters have always had a passion for food. Or as you said, Adi, even more importantly, I always say you invest in the slope, not the intercept. Mm-hmm. These are people that as they've started to try to eat more and more, they're like, I can do this. In other words, the derivative early on in their experience, just like in baseball, basketball, tennis, someone is not a bad tennis player for 7 years. And then all of a sudden at age 20 says, I think I'm going to try out for Wimbledon. No, I mean, you have to get positive derivative when you start out something, and that's probably going to make you work harder, thinking you can even achieve more. I don't know why it would be any different than competitive eating.
Eric, have you ever attempted to eat a large amount of food very quickly? Is that something you've ever tried? You are clearly our most passionate follower.
Yeah, I've eaten a large quantity of food, but I'm not really a very fast eater in that way. As a matter of fact, I've never even, maybe this will be the year that I'll do it, I've never even said on July 4th, like in the 10 minutes that they're given, how many hot dogs can I eat? Now, of course, I'm not eating the hot dogs and the buns dipped in water. I'm just going to eat hot dogs. But I've said this, and I'm pretty sure this is true. I think I could eat, if I say a number, you guys might say, all
right, this should be fun. How many hot dogs can you eat in 10 minutes? All right. How many? I think I could do. I have a number for myself.
I think I could eat somewhere between 10 to 12.
Okay. I'm a little lower, but I was going to suggest 8 to 10 for me personally.
Shane?
What can you do?
10's what popped into my mind, basically about 1 minute or so, but I do want to eat them normally. So that is the thing. I mean, that's the thing for me is I've always enjoyed eating and I've been good at it in kind of a volume sense, but the speed aspect of it, I think, a large part of my enjoyment of eating food is, taking the time to actually taste it and not making myself sick from it. So this idea that I guess I'm kind of equally intrigued by Adi's kind of like early development question here, like what you kind of, I guess you certainly like eating food and you're good at it, but like you kind of notice that you can sort of do it very quickly without any kind of really unpleasantness.
Yeah, let me go back to Adi's original question, because let's try to be Moneyball people. And we're just happen to be applying it right now to the WFOCE. Joey Chestnut has got to be close now to age 40. I haven't looked up his age, but I think he's close to age 40. That obviously, my guess is that's not the peak elasticity of your stomach or your throat or your esophagus, but his talent level must be above other people such a degree that no one has come up and caught him at this point. Now, Adi, it could be your rationale, which is there just aren't enough people. Like, in other words, he's the maximum of a distribution. It's not like there's 10 million people trying to catch him. It's a small number of people trying to catch him. But if we're still doing Wharton Moneyball in 20 years, are we going to be saying, wow, that 60-year-old Joey Chestnut has 32 titles out of the last 35 years? Because it's just his gap is so large, and it's just, even though his age curve is having him decline, is there any way we could start to think about what age curves look like in this sport? Or
what is his gap? Can you give us some numbers? Give us some context here. How many hot dogs do you eat in 10 minutes?
We'll just give you an example. His record number of hot dogs is somewhere, I don't think he's gotten to 80 yet, but let's say he will certainly eat above 70, and well, depending on the heat, but he'll certainly eat above 70, but probably he's going for somewhere in the 80 range. Okay.
So like 10 times what your estimated intake was, Adi.
Yes, exactly.
Right,
I can see that.
exactly.
So 10 times. What I take 10 minutes, he does in 1 minute. And tell me what is number 2?
Yeah, so I think Matt Stoney, is the number 2 ranked eater. When he beat Chestnut, it was a down year for both of them because of the heat. I think Stoney ate 66 and maybe Chestnut ate 63. But no one else besides Kobayashi and Chestnut has ever reached 70 before. So he has at least, this is a good way to think about it, he has, just going into the competition, bare minimum, you'd have to say he's got at least a 10 hot dog expected gap between him and number 2. And it might even be 15 hot dogs. Like, if you told me right now to make a bet on second, I'd say second. And I can't tell you who it's going to be. Might eat 60 and he's going to eat 75. And so he'd have to have a really bad day and they'd have to have an exceptional day. And also, I know I'm going to say this in a statistical way. You laugh because I'm talking about hot dog eating. I don't think the standard deviation of performance in hot dog eating is that high. It's not like he's going to have a day where he eats 40. It's just not going to happen. And a hot dog person is not going to have a day where they're going to eat 70.
You mentioned, though, one thing that I think probably would drive greater variation than sort of you would usually see, which is kind of, weather. Like, I assume, like, if you were to see a standard deviation, a deviant bigger than that, it would be because it's, 110 with high humidity or something like that. I mean, Joey Chestnut presumably is still human and would not be able to, get nearly to his usual performance levels in like a really adverse weather kind of situation, like extreme heat.
Yeah, last time I checked, by the way, they're looking fortunate for Monday. It looks to be about 80 degrees, which is pretty good. I think I told you guys a couple of years ago, my middle son Zach, who Adi knows well, went to the hot dog eating contest, and he told me to place a bet on the under of 72 hot dogs because it was 98 degrees out and really hot. And let me tell you what happened in the event. This may get to your point, Shane. Joey Chestnut, after 5 minutes, had something like 48 hot dogs. And I'm like, I'm doomed. He didn't even make it to 70 in the second 5 minutes. The heat, the heat basically destroyed. People were like, he's going to eat 85, he's going to eat 90. And he slowed down to where he was eating only 3 or 4 hot dogs per minute, which for him, he's going for 10. As a matter of fact, just to show you the over-under, this shows you the non-linearity of things. The total over-under right now is 73.5. Okay? For the first minute, it's 9.5, just to show you. So 10 times 9.5 is 95. You'd be like, well, if he could just eat 9.5 every minute, he'd eat 95. It goes from 9.5 to 73.5 total, which means, just the average has to be around 7, which means in the last minute, your over under might be 4.5 or 5, just to show you how much degradation you get from the first minute to the last.
So is it the case, kind of like we've learned in many of our shows with horse racing, is that competitive eaters never actually speed up. They just slow down more, the great ones slow down more slowly than
It's great that you bring that up, Shane. I hadn't thought about that point, but if you look after 3 minutes of the hot dog eating contest, you'll say, this might be the year. Matt Stoney and other guys, they're right up there with Chestnut. And then after 6 minutes, he will have degraded a little. He'll have slowed down a little bit, and they'll have slowed down a lot. That's exactly what happens. If this was a 2-minute hot dog eating contest, they've optimally designed the length in the sense of the true ability is going to come out. If you made it 4 minutes, 5 minutes, I think you'd find much more variation, which is not that surprising. Yadi?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm just this whole hot dog thing. I'm just
no, but Adi, it's a Trojan horse.
Yeah.
Look at the topics we've been talking about. We've been talking about difference in ability.
Yeah.
We've been talking about training technique. We've been talking about slowing down, first minute versus last one. We're talking about the effect of factors like heat and weather. We talked about age curves. If I just, that's why I like talking about. Besides, I like hot dogs and I like the competition. It's a Trojan horse. Who cares that it's
all right? So in all seriousness, then I'm going to ask you a question. Do you really think he's 20-1, Joey Chestnut? Because my general view is just taking a page out of sports in general. Injury or some kind of suboptimal health condition or weather condition is in the 5 to 10% range of a possibility, and you got to seriously consider that. And I don't know if you could play the other side because you can't get the field at.
No, in the field you get it plus 650.
Yeah, so that's just not good enough, right? So there's a huge gap between 20-1 on Chestnut winning and 1-7 on the field.
He's like the Tiger Woods of hot dog eating, basically, where he kind of throws the odds on.
The one thing besides heat, of course, Adi, using the vernacular of us competitive eaters here, there is the probability, of course, of the reversal of fortune, which would lead to the automatic disqualification. So even if Joey Chestnut feels fine, the heat is fine, there is a possibility you eat a hot dog and you have a reversal of fortune. And that, of course, would lead you to losing the competition. And that has to add a couple of percent. I mean, there has to be some probability on the 70th hot dog, of things go the opposite direction.
Has that happened to Joey Chestnut before?
It has not happened to Joey Chestnut before, but let me just tell you, it's looked like it was going to happen to Joey Chestnut.
Can I ask another question about the competitors? Is this his full-time job? He makes enough money as eating?
He's actually, interestingly, he was trained as an engineer. Matter of fact, the first 6 or 7 years of competing, as far as I know, he still had his job. He now, does corporate events. And of course, WFOCE doesn't just do hot dogs, but they do all pies and milk and Spam and wings and all kinds of other stuff. I think he gets appearance fees to appear around the country as a competitive eater. Yeah, I believe it's his full-time job. Well, either way, we will see you on July 4th. And remember, to all your listeners here on Wharton Moneyball, 11 a.m. Eastern now, not your normal 12 o'clock time. And if you're expecting them to be in front of the Nathans, they're doing it actually in a stadium this year, but it is outdoors and there will be fans. So it's exciting that it is back. So this is Eric Bradlow. We're here on Wharton Moneyball, and I'm here with my co-hosts Shane Jensen and Adi Weiner. Some combination of us are here every week, recording here on our SiriusXM Wharton Moneyball podcast edition. So guys, maybe to a more serious sport. I don't know if it's a more serious, not to me it isn't, a more serious sport or not. Let's talk about the NBA and what's going on in the NBA right now, because it's one of these strange situations. So, we have the Phoenix Suns in the Western Conference that are up 3-2. They had a very surprising outcome in yesterday's game at home in Game 5, up 3-1. I think the final score, they lost by somewhere in the 12-14 range. I turned it off in the last minute or so. Now we have the issue of, and by the way, just to remind our fans here, the LA Clippers, I believe, were down 2-0 in this series, but have been down 2-0 in the previous 2 series that they came back and won. They won the first round in 7. The next round they won in 6. They actually won the next 4. How do we think about the Western Conference right now? And will the Clippers be the first team in NBA history to come back, 3 series, 2-0 down and win this 4-3? Shane, what do you think?
I mean, it certainly makes me want to happen just because the uniqueness of that, and then maybe they go down to a 2-0 to the Bucks or whatever as well in the finals. I mean, I do think. I mean, I guess I wouldn't put it. I would still certainly favor the Suns of the series, given that they only have to win 1 more as opposed to the 2. But I mean, to the extent that there's any kind of momentum, and I'm with you, Eric, I do believe in momentum in short series. Especially in basketball and hockey. I think, I would sort of say that, like, if I was a betting man, I would probably put it more like, maybe to like 2/3 or something like that for the Suns. which gives, of course, the Clippers a real chance.
So just to be clear, and Adi, I'd love your estimate on this as well. Let's say I tell you right now that tomorrow night the Clippers win. So it goes to 3-3 game 7. Game would be at Suns. What odds do you give the Suns and what odds do you give the Clippers? Remember, the Clippers will have the momentum, will have just won games 5 and 6. What odds would you give the Suns to win game 7? Anything more than 50%?
Yes.
More than 50%?
Well, they'll be home to start with, and I believe they're the favorite to start with. So
they're both of those things. So
you got to push it at least to 65%. So I'd go 2-1 on the Suns.
Really, in game 7?
Well, you know what? I'm not so momentum. I don't know whether. I mean, I don't know whether I think there's a strange relationship between games in basketball. I don't know if I can categorize it or if anyone has appropriately categorized it to me in a way that's predictable, right? We obviously observe these things, but it does seem to be that there is a serial autocorrelation of some kind in basketball that I don't think.
So just explain to our listeners what you mean by serial autocorrelation within a series in games.
Right. So essentially, when you try to predict the outcome of any given game, what goes into that? So obviously the players on either side, whether it's home or away, anybody who might be injured, any environmental issues that can potentially come in, combinations. But now the question is, do you add the results of the previous games in a way that's above and beyond the how they estimate the playing ability of the players, right? So obviously, if a player got injured in the previous game, causing them to lose that game, and now they're still injured the next game, that already accounts for some sort of connection between the games. So essentially, what you're saying is the result of the previous games, do those matter in terms of making a prediction on any given day? That's an autocorrelation. And I believe that there really is some in basketball.
But let's
be clear,
just for our listeners here on Wharton Moneyball, what Adi's also talking about, which is so crucially important, is a conditional autocorrelation. So Adi's conditioning on who's home, who's away, who is favored in advance, maybe the season record. You're saying, is there extra predictive ability above and beyond the standard variables you'd use for a win? And you believe there would be a positive coefficient. There might be a positive coefficient to state dependence. I don't know. Maybe you don't. Maybe you don't think it's positive.
I think there's something related. I wish I could say I knew it, even if it was positive or negative. I almost feel like when a team loses in basketball, the other team learns from that mistakes and those set of mistakes in such a way that they makes them better than than they were the previous game. I don't know whether that's good enough.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think? So number one, do you think that affect? So I have a sequence of questions where statistics show. So let me go through the sequence of questions. So first, I'll ask both of you. I'll start with you, Adi, and then Shane. Do you think the effect is asymmetric, meaning the effect given a loss is different than the effect given a win?
Okay, so I think it is. And my information, I'll just give you, comes from our own Moneyball conversations we've had with our experts who've tried to explain these things to us. And one of the things that I think I've learned from this conversation is that basketball is a really complicated game in the sense that the way you prepare for a game really depends on your specific opponent. And during the season, you don't do that very much. But during a 7-game series where you're playing again and again a well understood opponent, you'll learn a lot from what happened in the previous game. And I actually think that when you probably learn more from a loss than a win. So maybe I am saying it is asymmetric, and that when you lose, you learn more from that in terms of strategizing your defense, if you will, your offense. You know what somehow worked or didn't work. Basketball is a hugely complex game. There's lots of ways to score baskets, right? And you can probably change your strategies given on what happened, given the results of previous games, particularly when they didn't seem to go well for you.
So Shane, let me go to you on this one, and then I have two more. So Shane, you go. Let's finish on the asymmetry, and then I have two more questions, and the next one I'll start with you, Shane.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly. I assume with the asymmetric thing, we're really thinking about regular season games where you'd actually change opponents, right? I'm not quite sure I know how to think of the asymmetry in like a series where you're playing the same opponent, multiple times in a row, in which case, the favorable or unfavorable matchup that led to a loss by one team also kind of supports the win by the other team. So I'm not quite sure how to think about that. But in the regular season, like when you have when say, you got an injury or something's exposed about your system, I do think there's an asymmetry. And I think that, the sort of like recovery or whatever from a loss is in time, I think asymmetric or more dramatic than the plus that you get from a win.
So let me go to you, the next one quickly, Shane. Adi said he's conditioning on a win. Do you care about the size of the win? So what are your thoughts on that? And then I'll go to Adi on that one.
At a certain point, yes. I mean, I think a close game versus a not close game, there is some signal there. I wouldn't do a linearity thing, right? Like a blowout that's 15 points versus a blowout that's 25 points. I don't think there's any distinction there. But I would make I do think I would make a distinction between a close victory versus, kind of essentially like a coin flip victory versus something where you showed more dominance.
And Adi, what are your thoughts?
I think I have to pretty much agree with Shane. I don't have anything different.
So are you surprised then? Does it add any? And I have one last one. Do you have any surprise then that not only did the Clippers win at Phoenix, but they won by 12 to 14 points? Doesn't that suggest a little something more than just a win? I mean, that's a big win.
Yeah, and I don't know if that suggests, like an extra drive by the Clippers or, a sense of sudden complacency by the Suns that they certainly haven't displayed up until now. So I'm not quite sure what it shows, but I would, it makes me view the Suns less favorably, that blowout, than if it was just a kind of a coin flip, very close victory or loss.
Maybe in the last minute we have, Adi, let me ask you the last one. Do you think this effect is stationary? In other words, beginning of the series versus end of the series. I mean, these are the standard things we as statisticians think about. If we think, is there an asymmetric effect? Does it matter on the size? And is it stationary? That's why I was saying game 7. Would 2 wins in a row at games 1 and 2 change whether it was games 5 and 6? Would you look at it any differently depending on where it is in the series? Adi, let me start with you.
Yes, I think it does make a difference. I think that the beginning is, you learn a lot more in the beginning than late. And I frankly, I wish I knew a little bit more about the intricacies of basketball, and that could help me understand like the different strategies and how you might change your play. But enough that I've seen suggests that you do change, and you do change probably rapidly in the beginning. It's not like I think that when you're playing the same team over and over and over again, things that's information that's useful.
And Shane, just quickly to you, 15 seconds.
I'll only add on. I mean, I agree with Adi. I'll only add on that the one thing about a late kind of 2 game or 3 game in a row thing suggests is that you can win both at home and away, because in the later parts of the series, you're actually switching locations, between every game.
Good point as well. It raises the Clippers' chances because Game 6 is back in LA. So this has been the first half of Wharton Moneyball. On behalf of myself, Eric Radlow, Shane Jensen, Adi Weiner, we hope you've enjoyed the first half. Stay with us and join us right after the break.
You're listening to Wharton Moneyball
on Business Radio.
Welcome back to Q3 here of Wharton Moneyball. This is Eric Radlow, professor of marketing and statistics, and I'm here with my co-hosts Shane Jensen and Adi Weiner, both professors of statistics. We're here on the podcast version of Wharton Moneyball. Some combination of the three of us and Cade Massey are here every week here on Sirius XM 132, coming to you asynchronously, but someday again soon we'll be live. And there's a way for you to contribute, and that's how we're going to start off Q3 of our show. If you want to send us an email question, please send it to moneyball@wharton.upenn.edu. That's moneyball@wharton.upenn.edu. As a matter of fact, we got a question over the last week that I think was pretty much directed directly to our hockey expert, Shane. So Shane, why don't you start us off, tell our audience here what the question was, and then we'll do our best to answer it.
Yeah, so it's from a couple weeks ago. It's from Stefan Teodeskos, and thank you very much for the question. It's basically talking about or observing the long drought that has happened in a Canadian team winning the Stanley Cup. And so we're kind of reminded of that drought this year.
When is the last time that a Canadian team has
So we're kind of, 1993 is the last time, and it was the Montreal Canadiens. So we're getting kind of more reminders of it this year because, of course, the Montreal Canadiens are in the finals. And so they have yet another chance to end this drought. And the question was basically, given that that's essentially a 20-year period, and we're talking about, 5 or 6, essentially, what is it, like 25% at least of the teams in hockey. What are the chances that this is kind of just like bad luck or versus like something different from that? And I do have a few thoughts on that. Mostly that I think it's just bad luck, but I'll come back to that. But one thing that was worth noting that at least, in the mid to late 90s, that kind of structurally led to a disadvantage to Canadian teams is that essentially is when free agency really kind of started hitting its stride in hockey. And it was also coinciding with a time when the Canadian dollar was relatively weak relative to the American one. And so I think Canadian teams, at least in the kind of first years of this so-called drought, maybe were actually at a structural competitive disadvantage to American teams. I don't think that is still the case, certainly. So I don't think there's any kind of structural thing. Most of, I think, the last 20 years of drought or so, or I guess now I'm thinking about it's 30 years of drought or so, have been mostly bad luck. And I mean, really kind of the probability question one of the probability questions you can ask is, we've had Canadian teams get to the finals. This is the sixth time, I think, in the last 30 years that a Canadian team has gotten to the finals.
So let's be clear. The reason
and they've lost all those previous 5 times. The reason
that's interesting, by the way, that's a really important stat. I'd love Adi to comment on it too, is that they're getting there in basically an expectation with the fraction of teams, but they're not winning.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
That's, you could say, well, they're not good. Well, they're getting there 1/5, 1/6 of the time, and that's roughly their fraction.
So it's really kind of what the real probability question. I do want a probability calculation, but I have one more kind of thing to add once Adi gives us that probability calculation. It's really just about like essentially 5 losses in a row or something like that. So if you think about like losing 5 finals, and it's spread among. I mean, the kind of cool thing is it's spread among the Canadian teams: the Oilers, the Flames, Canucks, most of the Sanders have all gone to the finals and lost.
Right. So can I ask a background question for our listeners who don't know the details? You said there's 25% of the teams are Canadian.
I mean it's either 5 or I think it's 6 or 7 now out of 30 to 31. Right. I mean, both those numbers have changed over the span of this drought, so that's why I'm kind of giving.
If it's 30 years, you have 60 teams that make the finals, right? So you should have expected a quarter of them to have been Canadian teams. That's more like 15 or 16 rather than 6. So that's just not that much. Remember, 2 teams make the finals, right?
Yes, that's right. No, that's true. That's true. So maybe they actually are.
So they seem to be deeply underperforming.
Reduced playout.
And then not winning all 6 of them, it's like double trouble. You're way under in terms of number of making it. Now, is that because usually that happens because there's a couple of teams that just forget it? Are there any of these Canadian teams that just are not in the running at all, that just never can?
Not during over that span. Almost every Canadian team, at least at some time in the last 30 years, has been competitive. And again, it's not like it's the same team going to the finals each time and failing. Mm-hmm. It's like that's been kind of spread out, which does sort.
Yeah, so I suggest the question that the person asked was a valid question in the sense is, now back to Adi's point, is that there are 30 teams. I just checked. There are 6 of them are Canadian teams. So there are 60 slots that have been available, and 6 of those 60 slots were taken up by Canadian teams. And so that's low in itself. And of course, the outcome is low in itself. So this is, by the way, why the question that was asked was such a great one, because this is something empirically we've noticed. Yeah. Now we can try to construct a story for it, but it's not like he's picked us out an event that has a probability of 18% of happening. If you told somebody you flipped a 0.75 coin, or a 0.25 coin in this case, and you had 60, you'd expect 15, right? Quarter of 60 is 15, and we're getting 6. And so that seems to be well, we can do the standard deviation is roughly the square root of the number of expected, so it's around 3.5 or 4. So we're at least 2 standard deviations below what we would expect here, which makes it about a 2% probability event.
Right, and here's a very statistical question. At what point does the deviation the probability become small enough that we now talk about a curse as opposed to it just being bad luck? And there is there's a curse narrative here. So in 1993, just as another little quick history lesson, in 1993, when the Montreal Canadiens won the Stanley Cup, they won against the Los Angeles Kings, one of Gretzky's final years with the team. There was a really controversial sort of refereeing side of outcome during that series. The Montreal Canadiens were already down 1-0. And in game 2, they were down in the third period. And the Montreal bench ordered an inspection of Marty McSorley's stick. Marty McSorley was one of the LA Kings players at the time. They wanted the stick inspected to make sure it didn't have an illegal amount of curvature. You guys probably didn't even know that there are rules.
No. I knew there were rules. First of all, I know what curvature of a stick means. I know they check it. My sons never played hockey, but they played lacrosse. They check the basket on your stick to make sure it's not, you can't more easily catch the ball. But yeah, of course, there's curvature rules.
Never before this been checked in the Stanley Cup Finals, and it was an illegal amount of curvature. The LA got a penalty because of it. Montreal scored on that penalty and went on to win the series. And so, at least if you were to talk to an LA Kings fan, from that point forward, they put a curse on the Canadiens, and it's kind of now extended to all of Canada.
So let me ask you, forget, maybe there's a curse, but I certainly probably don't believe that. When do we get to a point, maybe Adi, you could jump in here. When do we get to a point where this is so statistically anomalous that there must be, this relates to a general problem. When we can't explain something through probability, there's probably something wrong with our probability calculation. Like we're assuming stationarity, or we're assuming independence across years, or we're assuming that, they should get a uniform number, even though, because they're 6 out of the 30 teams. You have to, at some point, the probability under an assumed model gets so low, you have to start saying the assumptions of the model are probably false in some way. Adi, what are your thoughts there? And you're on mute, Adi. You're still on mute. There you go.
It's about 1 in 1,000. If the change that a Canadian team does not win, it's actually 0.8, since 6 out of 30 is 20%.
Yeah.
So 0.8 raised to the 30th power is about 1 in 1,000. Is that small? A 1 in 1,000 event, that's an extremely rare number. I mean, that of course happens.
Yeah, and I guess, I was of course being facetious when I called it this curse, though I do like the idea of this curse of Marty McSorley. But I think, Eric's kind of asking the question I was really trying to ask, is it like, at what point do we sort of like, do these probabilities become so low?
0.8 to the 30th isn't right.
Yeah.
I don't think, listen, 0.8 to the 30th is not right, obviously, because the teams are not, in any given season, it's not a random there. There's correlation, the team that won one year is going to win the next year. Over this 30 years, which was the most dynastic team in hockey? Shane, which one was there one?
There's been several dynasties. The Pittsburgh Penguins, two different dynasties of the Pittsburgh Penguins essentially have happened in that.
So that means the 30 is garbage. You don't really have 30 independent observations, because the Pittsburgh Penguins and the dynastic teams, they win more frequently in their season.
And there hasn't been the same number of even Canadian teams over that time span as well.
Right. Just to your point, if people say, if that 30 is cut down to 25, now you have to remove 0.8 to the 5th, which now all of a sudden maybe it's still 1 in 200 or 1 in 250, but it's not 1 in 1,000. And those numbers are very different from a statistical perspective. 1 in 100 versus 1 in 1,000. 1 in 100 things happen. 1 in 1,000, we're starting to get to a point where they don't happen as much. Well, that's an interesting look. Thank you to and remind us again, Shane, who is
Stefan Teodescu.
Well, Stefan, thank you for the question. And you too can ask a question that we'll cover on Wharton Moneyball. We'll get to another one in just a second, but at moneyball@wharton.upenn.edu. Adi, I think we also got one about baseball. It'd be great to hear from you what that question was.
Actually, the question is about basketball.
Oh, basketball. Sorry.
It's from Larry Abel, who asked the question. It's actually an very interesting question. So the background is that the NCAA has ruled that players can make money on their likeness, whether that's autographs or signatures or apparel.
Let's be clear. It went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled this.
Well, they certainly ruled that they had. I'm not sure it was part of that decision, but maybe influenced by that decision. That had to do with more educational benefits, like giving them computers and things like that. And the bottom line is that what this does is it allows the elite players, certainly, and really only the elite ones, to make substantial amounts of money. And the question from Larry Abel is, does that change the draft calculation from the player level? In other words, if you're a one and done freshman who has the opportunity to make quite a big deal of money. Think about who is the greatest freshman one and done basketball player in the last couple of years. Was it Zion? He was spectacular. He couldn't make any money and while he was in playing basketball in college, but if he could make money, he probably could have made several millions or more, and that it maybe hedges his risk. So I suggest my initial answer would be yes, it would. You would imagine players potentially playing out their college careers with higher probability. The question is how big that effect size is, and I'll leave that to you to suggest answers.
Well, so let me just start before I even talk about the difference in the draft. Let's talk about its effect on college. So do we agree with the following, that if more players stayed longer, you could make an argument, assuming there was some differential across which teams, it could make college basketball more competitive. In other words, there will be a larger set of teams that are able to compete for the national championship, because there's still going to be the one and done players, but now there's more of an incentive for someone who's a very good player but can make a good living. Maybe they stay more years, maybe, and if we believe years helps you become a better player, then do we think it'll make college basketball more competitive going forward? Like, Adi, let me ask Shane, start with you. If we had to look at the number, maybe, I don't know if this is the right measure, but let's say we take the last 30 years and we measure the number of unique champions there have been in terms of schools, and we looked at the next 30 years now that players can make money. How certain are you that there's going to be more schools in that set of 30 years as opposed to less?
Not very certain at all. I mean, it's a very complex question, because it really kind of goes to sort of like our kind of forecasting of the sort of decision making and how these things kind of cluster. You could imagine that, athlete, like certain kind of powerhouse schools, would be able to kind of essentially like just add financial packages essentially, on to kind of to make them even more sort of, you could see that, or maybe it decentralizes things, and, kind of schools that don't have the sort of historical pedigree
right.
can instead kind of compensate in some other way the athletes and kind of draw more in. I mean, it's kind of like, kind of historically, has free agency made increased or decreased parity when it hit professional sports? I guess is maybe the historical analog one needs to look at.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to Larry's direct question, is about how it's going to affect the NBA. So do we agree that potentially it has the ability to reduce uncertainty of the percent of quality when players are drafted? Wouldn't that be the likely thing? And also it might raise the, they're more NBA ready. So now the question becomes, what impact does a reduction in uncertainty have? Like, would we see less trades, more trades? Would we see teams wanting to be higher up in the draft, lower up in the draft? Any thoughts on that, Adi? Any thoughts on the role of uncertainty in, let's call it, draft order, ranking value? Does it make the number one pick even more valuable, less valuable? Any thoughts there just from the top of your head? It's a tough question he's asked.
Well, yeah, it is a tough question. I think that the number one pick potentially becomes more valuable because you can keep that player longer. Actually, you might, sorry about that. I got it getting wrong. If you're talking about the NBA draft, it's less valuable because you may not get them. I mean, this is the biggest tragedy, biggest difficulty in baseball. When you draft a high school player, they may go to college.
Right.
In the NBA draft, you don't see that now. Will there be that, or do you have to, actually, let me ask a detail. This is a technical detail. When you're in college, if you declare for the draft, can you decline the pick and go back to school?
I think the answer is, after a certain point, you can't. I think once, like if you've hired an agent or anything like that, you can't. But if you don't hire an agent, this will make a change too. If you don't hire an agent, you can go back.
So that's the question. Will someone get drafted who has been waffling about whether they'll actually go? And it also will change the criterion about the market size, because take a school in, say, California, maybe a USC, you've got a lot bigger market there for paraphernalia and logos.
Yeah, great. So great point. Actually, teams, the Gonzagas of the world, it may be harder for them to recruit people if there's a financial component and just bigger markets. Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Larry, for asking your question. Again, you too can ask a question, moneyball@wharton.upenn.edu. So guys, that's been 3/4 of our show. We have a great interview coming up with Neil Payne, senior writer at 538. So please stay with us and join us right after the break.
You're listening to Wharton Moneyball
on Business Radio.
Welcome back to Wharton Moneyball. This is Q4. This is Eric Bradlow, professor of marketing and statistics, and I'm here with my co-host, Adi Weiner, and Shane Jensen should be joining us as well. Some combination of the three of us, and Cade Massey are here every week, and we're obviously doing the podcast version. We're thrilled to have, I don't even know if I should call him a visitor, because he's, if you count, I'm sure he's the 5th most person to be on Wharton Moneyball. And of course, that's Neil Payne, one of the longtime friends of the show. I think everybody knows he's a senior writer at 538. He wrote previously for ESPN Insider, the New York Times, sportsreference.com, also did some work for the NBA's Atlanta Hawks. We're going to have to hear about that as well. Neil, so welcome back to Wharton Moneyball.
Hey, Eric. Hey, Adi. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, great to have you. Last time we saw each other, we were in the upstairs at Yankee Stadium. And,
we were, yeah. And I see you've got the Yankee hat on to commemorate that, I assume.
I do. I didn't know. I would have worn my Yankee hat on, too, if I had known. I should know Adi's going to wear it to counterbalance the evilness of Shane Jensen's Boston attire. So
yeah, that's got to be on our agenda today, talking about the Yankees collapse. You had written an article some time ago after they had been swept by the Red Sox, and now they've been swept again. So it's an unfortunate, it's not a happy moment for us Yankee fans.
Well, Neil,
yeah, every time things seem like they've sort of hit rock bottom this season, they find a way to get worse, I think.
Well, why don't we start there, Neil, since we don't have, we have lots of topics to talk to you about. One of the great things about having you is that you write about pretty much every sport. Why don't we start with the Yankees? You wrote a recent article about the Yankees trusting the process. It's been hard this season. So where do you see the Yankees right now, and what are their challenges?
Well, yeah, I mean, in that story, I talked about how they were one of these teams that, we hear this phrase, trust the process. Obviously, we think about the Philadelphia 76ers and Sam Hinkie, I think primarily when we talk about that. But in general, it's also this idea of, when you have results that go a certain way that, maybe you'll have bad results, but if the underlying numbers and the underlying process behind it are sound, then you sort of trust that with a larger sample size, your results will meet your process. And I think Aaron Boone and really the Yankees of this sort of recent vintage have preached that constantly. Like Aaron Boone is always talking about, oh, we had good ABs. Guys got a lot of good swings in. We got into good counts. We're hitting the ball well. Eventually, things are going to start turning around. And some of that is, I think he is a very almost irrationally positive person. But some of that speaks to, I think, the philosophy of this team, which is to sort of, if you have a good enough expected WOBA and you have good, exit velocity and all of this stuff, eventually your output will meet that. And I think that this is a real test for that mentality. And I'm curious what you guys think about that, because I think you guys are of that school that says that we should, if we have a good process and we know that some of the underlying indicators suggest that things should turn around, that you just need to accumulate enough of a sample size for that to happen. Now, my question is whether the Yankees, actually do have a good process, because I would argue that there are things around, and I think we talked about this last time, that yes, they have good hitters that are hitting the ball maybe better than their raw numbers would suggest, but also a lot of ways to give back runs around the periphery on the base paths, and in terms of clutch hitting and in terms of defense, certainly. And so I'm curious what you guys think about this idea of, when do you start to not trust the process? When do you abandon a process that seems like it is just not working? And how much evidence do you need before you try to find a new process?
So let me give you my thoughts, and then I'll quickly turn it over to Adi. As a diehard Yankee fan, that let's just do the math. First of all, you can look long term. We've won one title in 21 years, right? We've got 2009. I always forget which one the Phillies won and the Yankees. I think the Yankees won in 09. The Phillies were 08.
Yeah. How'd you pick that time span, Eric?
Because we won 4 out of the 5 before that. But I'm saying in the last 21 years, we've won one title, and that's one thing. But then also, I'm referring to, and I love Adi's thoughts on this, we're almost at the halfway point of the season. At some point, you have to say, this isn't the team that people forecasted with 98 plus wins. And we're probably well beyond that point now where, they'd have to win it like 120 win clip for the rest of the season to get to that number. So to me, I think of the process both in cross year and within year, and I have concerns. But Adi, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's, in your article, Neil, you talked about two issues which are statistically very interesting in the way they affect the Yankees. One is underperformance relative to Pythagoras. So basically, the Pythagorean formula says how many runs you give up, how many did you score, estimate how many wins you have, and when you have a deviation, that is usually a prediction about the future. So if you've under won relative to your Pythagoras, we expect you to regress back. If you've over won, you go down. the Yankees just are just not doing well on that score, period. The other thing you mentioned is what you called sequencing, which is a much more subtle issue.
Yeah, Adi, so tell our fans here on Wharton Moneyball what sequencing is. And of course, Neil's here, but he can tell us too. But go ahead.
Yeah, so Neil made the observation about Yankees. I should let him make that, but I'll define sequencing. Think about getting let's say a home run, 2 singles on a walk, and then 3 strikeouts. Well, that delivers exactly 1 run. Reverse it, and you've got 4 runs. That's sequencing variation. So it's the same production, but it turns out to a hugely different outcome. So what you want to just tell us what you discovered about the Yankees?
Yeah, so you're totally right that that there are these fluctuations between how many runs you actually score and how many we would predict you to score based on just knowing, the proportion of your plate appearances that end in various different events. And that can make a huge difference. And in the Yankees case, they're the team that has, whether you want to call it luck or clutch hitting or whatever you want to call it, they're the team that has undershot their predicted runs per game the most of any team in baseball so far this year, where they're scoring 3.97 runs per game. But if you look at a formula that they keep at Fangraphs called base runs, which predicts how many runs you should score based on the proportion of different offensive events that occur, they should be scoring 4.37 runs per game, which doesn't sound, maybe it's like, oh, it's fraction of a run or whatever, but it's the biggest shortfall of any team in the league.
It's also 60 runs, just to do the math. If that's 0.4 runs per game times 162, that's 60 runs, and Adi always reminds me.
That's 6 wins.
All right, well, that's a big number.
Yeah, no, that is, and it adds up a lot. And they've also been slightly underperforming in that regard in terms of the flip it around and look at how opponent hitters are doing against their pitchers. So if you add it together, and if you want to call that luck in terms of sequencing, they've been the unluckiest team in the league, and it's not even remotely close. The second most unlucky team are the Twins, and they're about 0.14 runs per game less unlucky than the Yankees are. So you could look at it that way and say, again, that's a process versus outcome type of thing, right? The runs per game, the actual scoring is the outcome, but the underlying, stripping away the sequencing effect number is the process. And so that sort of goes in everything about this team, I think, is sort of like they have the talent to be better. They have the sequencing independent numbers to have a better record. And they have, some of the StatCast metrics like the expected weighted on base average and the exit velocity and things like that to be hitting better. And yet, why are they not hitting better? And more broadly, why aren't they winning more? And that gets into this question of, is there something fundamentally flawed about the process that these metrics are not catching?
Shane?
Now, I want to hear Shane too, but he is lording over us with his baseball Red Sox hat and the 3. He's like, what would I do? I want to hear
the process is great for the Red Sox.
Yeah,
I want Shane. The process is great, but I've been watching a lot of Yankees baseball. And after enough, failures to deliver runs in the clutch, I'm not a huge believer in the clutch, but I am a believer in pitchers being able to pitch differently in different situations. So there's something about the way the Yankees are constructed, their home run kind of a philosophy that makes them susceptible to the new pitcher who can sort of bear down when the bases are loaded and get a strikeout. And the Yankees just seem not to be delivering runs.
Well, I mean, actually, that was along the lines of what I was going to talk about. Is one thing that you can, beyond sort of just the luck of sequencing and stuff like that, I think fault the Yankees for is I feel like it is somewhat of a flawed roster construction in the sense that they are very right-handed hitter heavy. I mean, extremely right-handed hitter heavy, which is extra odd given the dimensions of Yankee Stadium that you would construct a lineup in that way. But I think it speaks to maybe kind of some of Adi's what I just said, in that the sense that I think they can be more easily strategized before or whatever compared to other teams, right? And I think that kind of how right-handed heavy their hitting is, plus the fact that once they get on base, there's the fact that they can't kind of manufacture runs, or they seem to be either just slow or inept or whatever, getting runners over or keeping those players on base. I think those two things kind of have combined together to kind of add on to the luck of their underperformance.
So we're here on Wharton Moneyball. This is Eric Bradlow, professor of marketing and statistics. I'm here with my co-hosts today, Adi Weiner and Shane Jensen, both professors of statistics. And we're here talking to our longtime collaborator and friend, Neil Payne, from senior writer at 538. So, Neil, I could, of course, talk about the Yankees all day, but you've also written some articles about, for example, the MLB contender nobody saw coming, which I believe is the Seattle Mariners. And you also wrote an article about which MLB teams should be making midseason deals, which is always the question we have at this time of the year. Could you catch our listeners up on those two articles? And then, of course, we have to move on to the NBA because there's a lot going on in the NBA right now. But let's start with the MLB contender nobody saw coming and who should be kind of making deals at this time of year.
Well, yeah. So you mentioned the Mariners are the team that I think nobody really thought would be above 500 at the mid-season point. You could look at some other teams that have been, frankly, surprises, like Shane's Red Sox. I think no one, fully expected them to be quite this good. And the San Francisco Giants, I think, fall into the same category. But both of those teams, at least, they have the underlying talent, they have the track record, and they have, frankly, the payrolls to be teams that at least you're not surprised by seeing those teams at the top of their respective divisions and thinking like, okay, well, maybe they had been in what appeared to be a rebuilding phase, but they aren't anymore. And that's not totally shocking. What is a little bit surprising is that you've got this Mariners team that didn't have any buzz and no one was really thinking about their potential to be any good at all going into this season. And yet here they are, they're above 500. And one of the things I wanted to dig into was why, but also think about them as a franchise, because I do feel like, so they haven't made the playoffs since 2001. That was the year that they won, I believe it was 116 games, and then lost to, of course, the Yankees in the playoffs. But this franchise has had so many near misses of making the playoffs, potentially making the playoffs over that span and just not making it. In fact, Rob Arthur, who used to work with us at 538, now he's with Baseball Prospectus. He did what I thought was a really interesting story where he looked at, okay, given your record, what would be the probability we would expect of a team with that record to make the playoffs, just knowing nothing else about, who they were fighting against or whatever in those playoff races. But just in general, if you win 89 games, you should make the playoffs in general a certain percentage of the time, and so on and so forth. And he added that up and came up with this kind of expected number of playoff appearances for each franchise, going back 20 years or whatever, probably 15 years at the time. And he found that the Mariners had vastly underperformed in terms of playoff appearances, which of course are 0 versus expected. You would expect in some of those seasons where they won 90, 92, 89, all of these win totals, at least one of those would have been a playoff appearance. Just almost you'd fall backwards into it, even if you weren't necessarily trying.
Neil, could you do the following? Could you walk our listeners through, let's say you come to the realization, and this you can just observe, that Seattle's doing much better than maybe it was an expected win total at the beginning of the season, all the different forecasts. How do you start decomposing it? Like, do you just immediately go to the metrics, like the underlying performance metrics, and say, okay, they're doing better on this dimension than the average team, this dimension? How do you try to come up with a statistical story for why it's happening? And by the way, I would assume if I said the same thing to you, like, the Atlanta Hawks did better this year than people would expect in the NBA. Maybe you'd make it. The Montreal Canadiens did better in hockey than they would. I don't know. I'm just saying.
They sure did.
Right. No. So I'm saying is, how do we explain, let's call it positive exceedances, and how do we use the data and the metrics? How do you start to look at that and try to come up with an explanation? Just the process of doing so.
That's a great question. Yeah. And just to kind of peek under the hood of my process whenever I'm trying to write about one of these teams is I do sort of start with the building blocks. And I think a lot of this goes back to basically Bill James, right? And thinking about, okay, well, we know that there's a relationship between scoring points or runs or goals and allowing them and how much you win. And that is different slightly by sport, but it still is like a stable, predictable relationship. So then you can kind of say, okay, well, well, that's offense and defense, right? Well, first of all, there's also the luck aspect to it by looking at the difference between, the record you would expect based on scoring for and against and what record they actually have. And in the case of the Mariners, it's actually pretty historic in terms of a difference. They've won 6 more games already than they quote unquote should have based on their runs scored and allowed. So then you can break it into, okay, well, if they have a great offense, then, that explains some of their performance. Or do they have a great defense in baseball, breaking out the defense between pitching and fielding? And we have ways of doing that are more advanced now than certainly when Bill James was writing his abstracts in the 1980s. Yeah. And so I think of it as being, like building blocks, and sort of the biggest building block, the whole thing, I guess, is the team's overall record, and then breaking it out into the offensive and defensive and luck blocks, and then into sort of more fine-grained blocks from there. But I think that's one of the great things about some of the ways that sabermetrics has approached things over the past 30 years or so, is that it has been with an eye on basically almost finding, like, at the molecular level, or the finding the elements, the elemental level, and saying, like, what's the smallest sort of building block that we can kind of drill down into to try to explain why a team is successful, why a player is successful. And hopefully when you add up all of those things, it comes to the whole. And that I think is one of the guiding principles that has been baked into sabermetrics, since the very beginning. And maybe you could say, there are examples of teams, and maybe the Montreal Canadiens are one, maybe there's a team like the Kansas City Royals from a few years ago, any of these teams that, it's reductive to say this, but like the stats can't explain why they're good. I think there are teams like that. And there is an element of maybe, with a good coach and a lot of guys that really seem to have personal accountability to each other. And just, when we can't fully explain why teams get on rolls and exceed expectations through the numbers alone, I think. But I do think that has been one of the tasks of sabermetrics, has been to find these things that add up to the whole.
Let me ask you a follow-up question just briefly, and then I want to move to one other aspect of the MLB. And then I promise our fans here on Wharton Moneyball, we are going to get to the NBA. Is it fair to say, although we're a radio show, obviously we're here on Sirius XM 132, the podcast edition of Wharton Moneyball, is it fair to say that you would almost view it like a tree-like model? Like we have wins at the top, then we have offense and defense, and then you can break down offense into its metrics and defense into its metrics. This is what you were saying with the granular. In some sense, you could look at it as one big tree where maybe your outcome is wins at the top, and you're going to continue to break it down. And if you were using a machine learning model, you could literally fit a tree-like model that would see what are the separators, and then you would see where are the cut points, and then you would go as granular as you need to be to get good predictive models. For our listeners out there, is that approximating the process you're describing?
Oh yeah, I think completely, and that's kind of an interesting way that they basically, people like Bill James did that. But I assume that he doesn't know anything about, decision trees or machine learning or anything like that. Maybe he does now a little bit more, but certainly not in the 1980s. But they were able to intuit that and find, I always think, some of these formulas that he came up with, like the Pythagorean formula, like the runs created formula, they're just so different from what anyone was thinking of, and they have stood the test of time, that I do think that it's also not surprising that some of his methods for, like you said, building this tree of a team's performance have also been the type of thing that now, knowing what we do and having more sophisticated methods, we could replicate that, and we probably would find exactly the same sort of bins of performances to put into that add up to the whole and predict. I think especially also, that's the biggest thing, is there would be no value to any of this stuff if you couldn't add it up and say, well, this guy was worth this many wins, his fielding was worth this many wins, and kind of add up everything and say, okay, well, I know how good all the component parts are, but how good is the team? You can actually get really close to predicting how good a team is going to be if you knew nothing except how effective all of the component parts are.
I'm going to jump in, because what makes that work in baseball is an additive model. So you add up all those portions. And in fact, the decision tree that Eric was describing is actually the exact opposite of an additive model. So what you really, because what's happening is that you drill down to the location, and then you can go in either direction. And in baseball, the additive model really does work on a season level. It works on a team level, and you can add up the defense and the pitching and the base running and all that together, and you get a pretty good approximation. And that's why Pythagoras works over a season really nicely. Take just runs scored, runs allowed, and bang, you get a pretty good approximation of the number of wins. Where it doesn't necessarily work is when you try to think about moving players to different teams and doing things on an individual level, because a home run hitter will add a different amount to a different team depending on who's surrounding them. In baseball, it's not that much, but in other sports, it's just monstrous. And that, I think, is the next generation of what we're going to be seeing in sabermetrics, is trying to figure out how collections of players kind of work together. And this is the holy grail for football and basketball. Baseball, we've really never worried about it that much.
I think we may have lost Adi for just a second there. So Shane, I know you wanted to jump.
Well, I'll just point out that as what Adi, part of what Adi was saying, I think, is that, like, the other part that's kind of intriguing to me is that kind of goes away from that additive model is when you start talking about, like, kind of, instead of talking about outcome in terms of runs scored and runs allowed, which are themselves components of winning, when you start talking about making the playoffs, some of these outcomes that are at the team and season level, but aren't necessarily, going to be a direct kind of additive function of runs scored and runs allowed. I mean, this 10, wins to every, 10 runs to every win is kind of an additive approximation for every win. But, like, as far as taking a team into the playoffs, I think that's where, at the margins of where these teams are and how you're constructing rosters, I think that's where you kind of can differ from the additive model a lot. Like, a particularly complementary player can come in and have kind of a greater than additive expected contribution to making the playoffs.
And just ask the Mariners about that, bringing it all the way back full circle. There, maybe they could have used one of those players that instead of winning 89 games and missing the playoffs, get 90 wins and make the playoffs. But yeah, it's definitely, those are like nonlinear effects, right? Where the benefit of one extra win when you're moving from 80 to 81 is like nothing in terms of playoff probability. But when you're moving from 89 to 90, it could mean everything.
Right.
Yeah. Or I mean, look at the Phillies this year, who are another team I'm following. I think they just blew their 21st save of the season.
Correct. Yep.
Is that right?
What else is
I
new?
mean, right.
Let's be clear what they've blown, by the way. And then I want to move on. Let's be clear. They've lost 21 games where they held the lead during the game. They haven't blown 21. But let me just tell you, give Hector Neris enough time, and he will blow 21 saves by the end of the season. So let's give him. It's only half the season, Shane. Let's give Neris time to blow the rest of the games.
I thought I'd read somewhere that they'd blown 7 games in the last 7 leads in the last 6 games.
They have. Well, they can't. Well, maybe they've taken the lead.
They've blown 7 saves in the last 6 games, which is even more.
They have. I mean, I'll be happy to tell you every one of Neris's pitches and at-bats in the last 2 weeks, and it's not been good. So, Neil, we have about 80 topics left in just about 10 minutes. So what I want to do is I want to say a topic, and I just really want 30-second answers. I want to kind of do a rapid fire round with you and see how you react to each. But let's stay with baseball first. Sticky stuff in baseball, spin rates, what's its impact?
Well, we're seeing an impact already in terms of the spin rate for the league. It's way down. Just since they started cracking down, it went from being the highest of the StatCast era since 2015 to being the second lowest. It's the same roughly league-wide spin rate as it was in 2016, and that's just over the past 2 weeks.
Okay. So are you expecting, by the way, follow up to that, are you expecting batting averages, of course, therefore to go up? And are you expecting we're not going to maybe be the lowest historical batting average season maybe in the history of baseball?
Well, I'm expecting them to go up anyway because the temperatures are rising. We're going into the summer. You just see that pattern anyway. So it's going to be a little difficult to untangle that. I'm also expecting walks to go up. So I think it's interesting to see. I'll keep an eye on whether, yes, strikeouts might go down, but are you trading one true outcome for another?
Okay. Let's continue on now, maybe to the NBA. So Sixers and Ben Simmons, where do we go?
or is it Embiid who's the problem?
Yeah, well, you can add that. Well, then now I have to give Neil a minute, but I don't mind. He can talk about Simmons, Embiid, and what do we do?
I wish I knew the answer. I wish, if anybody does know the answer, it's probably Daryl Morey, but I think it's they're in a really tough spot, which is funny to say about a team that had such a great season as they had. But I do feel like there are things that about Simmons that are kind of incompatible with being in the role that he is, that they're asking of him to be on a championship type team, and that he would probably have more success in a different role somewhere else. How you make that work with his contract is one of the big things that Daryl Morey is going to have to figure out.
Yeah, I have to admit it. When you talked about trust the process early on, and in one of your articles regarding the Yankees, it reminded me of Andre Iguodala in the following sense when he was with the Sixers. You were just asking him to be the best player on the team and to be the number one scorer. And as we saw for the Warriors, he's none of those things. And I have a feeling you're asking Ben Simmons to be the second scorer on the team, maybe the third after Harris, and he's none of those things. In other words, if you asked him to do what he does great, he can be the best in the league at it. But the Sixers, by construction, are asking him to do things he's not capable. Like, they want him to put up 15 points a game, and that's just not going to be Ben Simmons. It's just not. Let's talk about something else. Now that we have the Hawks and the Suns both in the playoffs, we're doing quick word association again with Neil Payne, senior writer at 538. Trae Young.
Amazing. That's all I can say is he's been the heart and soul of the team, I think, also.
Do you have concerns? Because I'm pretty sure he and I are the same height. And I'm sure even if we are, that I weigh more than him.
Can you shoot like him, though?
I didn't say that, but I said I can eat more than him. So I think so. I weigh more than him. Do you have any concerns about his durability over the long run?
I mean, maybe, but I think we're seeing a league that is more predicated on players that look like him than players that you would consider to be, bigger and bulkier and more durable.
How about if I asked you now, this is my sons have asked me this question. If you had to redo I think it's 2018, maybe it's the 2019 draft, would you take DeAndre Ayton or Trae Young?
I would take Trae Young. Now, I thought you were going to ask me, would you trade Luka for Trae? And that, I think, is a fascinating trade. I thought it was at the time, and it's only become more fascinating ever since.
Yeah, just so all our listeners know, they were involved in the trade. I mean, that was the trade where the Dallas Mavericks traded up to get Luka Doncic, and the Hawks ended up getting Trae Young in this case, and obviously other capital. Let me just say, by the way, right now, because I was at the Clippers-Suns game the other night, and let me just tell you something. DeAndre Ayton is no joke. This guy can really play basketball. And now you're already looking at a draft. You'll remind me, Neil, who the other players were, but you're now looking at a draft with Ayton, Doncic, Trae Young. I mean, and maybe there are others. This was a very good draft class.
Oh, yeah. And it's funny because I don't know that there was like a huge amount of buzz around it. I think at the time people were like, oh, Ayton's the number one pick almost like by default. But, we're not sure how many other stars are going to come out of it. And yeah, it's I don't think people really appreciated how good Luka was going to be. I don't think they appreciated how good Trae Young was going to be. We've also seen other players that are like good players like Michael Bridges came in that draft. Mitchell Robinson on the Knicks, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, Michael Porter on the Nuggets. So
I would take any of those players you just mentioned on the Sixers.
Yeah, I'm sure they would too.
So where do you see the NBA playoffs right now? Obviously, I got home late last night to turn on the Suns-Clippers game. I saw obviously a disaster. I mean, the Suns won, but it was one of the worst basketball games I've ever been to. I think the final score was 84-81 the other night. I could not believe my son and I were there saying, is this 15 or just 14 missed shots in a row by both teams? But regardless, the Suns had the opportunity, obviously, to close out the series at home. They're now going back to LA for Game 6. Let's start with the Western Conference. How do you see that? How confident? What probability would you give the Suns right now to win this series?
Well, our model gives them an 81% chance. I think that might be a little bit high, but again, anytime you're in those situations where you only have to win one and they have to win two, and one of those two that they have to win is on the road, it does kind of add up to be in that range. I think that what the Clippers have done without Kawhi Leonard is pretty remarkable. Paul George has really risen to the occasion. I still think that the Suns will win the series, though. But I think it's a shame that Kawhi, and he's just the latest of many injuries in these playoffs that we've seen for stars, that he's not, they're not going to be at full strength. I'd be shocked if he came back at all, even if they win this series and played in the finals. And I don't know, it's kind of robbing us of seeing Kawhi Leonard in his element in the late stages of the playoffs. But the Clippers have done, a yeoman's job of just hanging in there even without him, I think.
Just for our listeners here on Wharton Moneyball, just what Neil's talking about, let's just say both teams had a 50% chance of winning each game. The reason Neil's saying 81% is a little high, but maybe not too high, most people get, well, what's the baseline? Well, the baseline is the only way the Suns can lose is loss. If each one had a probability of 0.5, there's a 25% chance. So they should be at a baseline 75-25. But you're mentioning, number one, there's some evidence maybe they're the better team because they had a better regular season and they're up 3-2, and they have home court. So 81-19, people are like, oh my God, that's terribly high. It's not that different than 75-25. I just want to give our listeners a way to norm that, most people would say, well, 60-40. Well, the baseline 75 just at 50-50.
Yeah, that's a great
point. Give our
point.
listeners a norm. How about the Eastern Conference? Obviously, the Bucks lost game one at home, but now appear to be the dominant Bucks we were all expecting. Are up 2-1, and Trae Young appears to be banged up. How do you see that going?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that the Bucks should pretty clearly be favored to win from here on, and it hurts me to say that because, again, like you said, I work for the Hawks. I grew up in Atlanta. I'm just have loved to see this run that this team is on. I think if Trae is less than 100%, though, it really, I mean, they're already up against, I think, a really tough Bucks team that maybe we forgot about a little or didn't give enough credit to as being as good as they are. But yeah, even with Giannis taking so long to shoot those free throws, not making his free throws or whatever, we saw, I think Chris Middleton, the Bucks are a very interesting team because, and we had a story on this, that their best player is not necessarily their fourth quarter closer. And we saw a little bit of that in the game the other day. And we've seen that throughout the playoffs. Really, Chris Middleton is their go-to guy when they need a bucket late in the game, in the fourth quarter of a close game. They go to him, which usually that's totally different than the majority of teams that have a star on the same caliber as Giannis.
I know you listen to Wharton Moneyball. Remember the Bradlow theory: when your best player is your center, you can't win close games unless you have another player that can close it down. You can't get the ball to Giannis enough. Once they pressure you in the backcourt, they throw it into the post. There's not enough time. You've got to have someone, and that's why the Sixers were hoping Tobias Harris would be that player, or in past years, Jimmy Butler was that player. It can't be Joel Embiid. And Simmons doesn't shoot the ball. That's why by construction, Embiid can have 35 points in the first three quarters and score 2 in the fourth. You're exactly saying what I've been saying all along.
And that's what I love about the way the Bucks are constructed is that they knew that. I think they sort of, whether it was explicitly they sat down and worked that out or just through, implicitly the way that they built the team, they tailored the supporting cast of this team to Giannis in a way that makes him better than, his impact becomes greater, talking about those ways in which players can kind of, multiply their advantages. I think that we're seeing that show up in the build of this Bucks team, especially when they added Drew Holiday. I think that's also another kind of really unheralded, huge addition that they made.
Since we may not have you on, Neil, before the NBA playoffs are over, it sounds like you're predicting Bucks versus Suns in the finals. Who do you like in that series? Any quick prediction?
I like the Bucks in that, but I think I'm going against our model, which thinks that the Suns would at least they have a higher probability of winning the finals, and it actually thinks the Bucks are more favored to make the finals in there. So there's you would think the Suns, conditional on making the finals, would have a bigger edge in terms of our model, but I think the Bucks it's their time. I'm going against the model, which is never a smart thing to do, but it keeps things fun sometimes.
Well, Neil, it makes it even scarier to think that it took the Bucks game 7 and a big toe by Kevin Durant, as they say, to even beat the 1.5-legged Nets. And imagine if the Nets had all three of their players, we might be talking about the Nets winning the NBA Finals.
Oh, I think we completely would. I mean, on paper, I think no team at full strength is as scary as the Nets were this season. But again, that's the rub of especially these playoffs is that few teams have been at full strength. The Bucks are one of those teams, I think, for the most part, depending on how you think of Dante DiVincenzo. But the Nets never really. I don't think they ever were at full strength.
Never.
That's going to be one
games.
of the big.
I think it was 6 games they played together.
Yeah, and that's going to be one of the big what ifs, especially if they're not able to keep them together going forward, or things they never are able to kind of achieve that potential. Is what if this core had been healthy? Because I do think that they were the best team in the league if they had been healthy.
Well, Neil, we'd like to thank you for joining us here on Wharton Moneyball. Neil is one of the long friends of the show. He's a senior writer at 538. Please continue to follow him. Neil, thank you for joining us here on Wharton Moneyball.
Thank you for having me. It's great, as always.
So this has been 4 quarters of Wharton Moneyball. On behalf of myself, Eric Bradlow, my co-hosts Shane Jensen and Adi Weiner, on behalf of our producer, Matt Datz, our associate producer and engineer, Dion Simpkins, we'd like to thank you for joining us. We're here on podcast, Sirius XM 132 every week recording. Between now and next week, enjoy your sports, enjoy your analytics. Lots to be excited about in sports. We'll see you next time here on Wharton Moneyball.
Wharton Moneyball.
There's something called the large deviations distribution. The basic idea is that you want to ask yourself what causes unusually unlikely events and how does that happen and what's the distribution on the individual components that make it up. And basically there's 2 alternatives. Either one unbelievably unlucky thing happens or lots and lots of little things. And it turns out in the theory of large deviations that it's the latter. Lots and lots of little things that break your way create the large deviation.
Wharton Moneyball, Wednesdays, 8 a.m. East on Business Radio.